Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something that's been making a lot of headlines, the whole idea of de-dollarization.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah, and what it could mean for, the future of global finance.
Right, exactly. Is the US dollar going to stay on top or are things going to change?
Exactly. And we've gone through a bunch of different sources for this. We've got some geopolitical analyses, some reports on how de-dollarization is actually playing out in trade, and even studies on what central banks are doing with their reserves.
Yeah, we've really tried to get a good mix to give, everyone listening a solid understanding of what's actually going on.
Right, because it can be kind of a confusing topic with, a lot of jargon and complex financial stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the weeds.
So what we really want to do today is, kind of cut through all that and figure out what's really driving this whole de-dollarization conversation. What could it mean for the average person? And yeah, and just get a better grasp on the nuances of all this.
Yeah, and see if we can separate fact from fiction because
Exactly.
there's a lot of hype out there.
So, I guess a good place to start would be with all the geopolitical stuff that's going on, because it seems like that's a big factor in why some countries are starting to question the dollar's dominance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the the current global climate, with all the tensions and conflicts, it's definitely pushing some nations to rethink their reliance on the dollar.
Right. It's like a wake-up call.
Yeah, and we're seeing this play out in a few different ways, like the sanctions and trade disputes that you mentioned.
Right. Like with Russia and China, for example.
Exactly. Those situations are really highlighting the potential risks for countries that are heavily dependent on the U.S. financial system.
Right. It's like suddenly they realize that their assets or access to markets could be restricted.
Exactly, and that's a huge vulnerability. And I think the freezing of Russia's dollar reserves was kind of a big aha moment for a lot of countries.
Think like, wow, this could actually happen.
Yeah. Exactly. It's not just theoretical anymore. It's like,
Mm.
okay, so if we get on the wrong side of the U.S., our economy could be in big trouble.
Right. And it's not just about, avoiding potential asset freezes or sanctions. It's also about the rising influence of other economies, right? Like China.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't ignore the fact that China's economic clout is growing and growing.
And they're actively promoting the use of their own currency, the yuan.
Yeah, exactly. And we're starting to see this translate into real world changes like Saudi Arabia and the UAE settling some of their energy trades in yuan.
That's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a sign of things to come. These kinds of bilateral currency agreements are basically cutting the dollar out of the equation.
Right. And it's not just happening on a country to country basis either. Our sources also talk about how central banks are starting to shift their foreign currency reserves.
Right, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear that the dollar share of global reserves has been declining.
Yeah.
It used to be over 70% back in the early 2000s, and now it's under 60%.
Wow, that's a pretty significant drop.
Yeah, it shows that central banks around the world are actively diversifying their holdings, moving away from the dollar and into other currencies.
Okay, so even though the dollar is facing these challenges, it's still the dominant reserve currency. Why is that?
Well, I mean, the U.S. financial markets are still the deepest and most liquid in the world.
So it's still the easiest and safest place to do business.
Pretty much, yeah. And that creates this kind of self-reinforcing cycle, because everyone's using the dollar. It makes it even more attractive to use the dollar.
Right, it's like a network effect.
Exactly. And that's not something that's going to disappear overnight.
So it's not like the dollar is about to be dethroned or anything.
No, our sources seem to agree that any kind of major de-dollarization would be a very gradual process.
Okay, so we're talking decades probably.
Most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's another important factor to consider, which is that there isn't really a single alternative currency that can match the dollar in terms of stability, liquidity, and global acceptance.
So it's not like there's an obvious replacement just waiting in the wings.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say that this shift away from the dollar does continue gradually. What kind of impact could that have on the global economy?
Well, one possibility is that we could see a move towards a more multipolar currency system.
So instead of one dominant currency, there would be several.
Right, and that could lead to a rebalancing of economic power.
Hmm.
Different countries and regions would have more influence.
And that could potentially make the global financial system more stable or less stable, right?
It's hard to say for sure. It's a very complex issue, but it's definitely something to think about.
So I guess the main takeaway here is that while the dollar is facing these challenges, it's not going away anytime soon.
Right, it's too deeply embedded in the global financial system for that.
But we are seeing signs of change. And this trend towards de-dollarization is something that's worth paying attention to.
Absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to see how things evolve over the next few decades.
So here's a question for everyone listening. We've talked about what a multipolar currency system might look like, but what are some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of such a system, for global stability and for the financial well-being of individual nations? It's something to ponder.
Yeah, it's a big question with no easy answers.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
See you next time.
See you later.